Good morning. I don't know if you can hear the sounds of tractors in neighboring fields. It's a beautiful summer's day, and for the first time the zendo has been too warm with all my robes on. So I've opened the windows and maybe you can hear the sounds of tractors in neighboring fields. Cutting grass. It's the first grass cutting that I've heard this season. And of course it reminds me of that poem I quoted in one of the earlier talks. Patrick Kavanagh, I think the poem is called That Garage. The sounds of land activity, machinery in gear. This is not longevity, but infinity. There's a certain way this background sound or noise, its continuous monotony, its continuous hum, somehow acts as a unifying quality for the visual field. And it's as though I would rather use the word eternity rather than infinity. It's as though eternity is just behind the thinnest of veils. This moment has an eternity about it. And every moment is the same. It's simply that the particular set of conditions and circumstances of some moments take us closer to that veil than others. And it reminds me of a story that's found in the Pali Canon of the Buddha, Siddhartha, as he realized that living on 1 grain of rice a day was actually going to kill him, and he would die without having realized his goal or satisfied his thirst for understanding the arising of suffering, or for not having found a way out of it. So he decided to eat again and regain some strength. And then he had a recollection of his childhood. I like to think of it as he was sitting on the garden fence and he was watching his father. I don't know if his father was plowing a field or just doing some kind of ritual to bless the field. And maybe as king, the blessing was that he plowed the first line of the field. And it's kind of assumed that what the Buddha was recollecting was a jhana experience in his childhood. And perhaps it was that he was just on this side of the veil to eternity. And as he wondered what way was it he should proceed now in his quest for nirvana, and he had this recollection of his childhood, and he said, maybe this is the way. What I would call a relaxed effort. Or maybe the approach to nirvana is eternity. So I have some questions for you and for me. But before I get to them, or as a way of getting to them, I'd like to say I like words. And I like how words can be used in different contexts, in different ways, have different meanings. What is the meaning that a particular set of words conveys? And is that particular set of words open to another interpretation? This could be seen as the essence of a joke. An ambiguity, an unexpected ambiguity. But without joking, I was musing during the week. It went like this. I take refuge in the Buddha. And then there is the two words that have to follow, that have a different meaning depending on how they are said. So here goes. I take refuge in the Buddha. Do you? I take refuge in the Dharma. Do you? I take refuge in the Sangha. Do you? Now listen to the same words again, but with a different meaning. I take refuge in the Buddha. Do you? I take refuge in the Dharma. Do you? I take refuge in the Sangha. Do you? So in the second set, you can almost sense another word. Do you now? Or do you really? But we don't need that word, so it doesn't have to be said. That extra word would help with understanding the meaning of the two words, do you? In the first set, I'm saying, I take refuge in the Buddha, do you? But in the second set, I'm saying it to myself, or I'm responding to somebody who says it. Somebody says, I take refuge in the Buddha, and I say, do you, really? Or do you now? Is that true? Or I say it to myself, I take refuge in the Buddha, and say, is that true? Do you? Do you really? So I entertained myself with this for a while. And that's the question. Do you take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, in the Sangha? And I don't mean it in any way judgmentally. It's not like you're supposed to. It's not like I want you to. It's not like that you should. It's just a question, do you? Do you take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and in the Sangha? And it's perfectly okay if you don't. I just want to get to know you. To get a sense of where you are at. And if your answer is, yes, I do, then I have one or two more questions for you. How do you take refuge in the Buddha? How do you take refuge in the Dharma? And how do you take refuge in the Sangha? And another question, when do you take refuge in the Buddha? When do you take refuge in the Dharma? When do you take refuge in the Sangha? So because the windows are open, not only can I hear the sound of these tractors, which seem to get closer and then further away, but I'm also hearing some delightful birdsong. And there's a breeze coming in every so often, which is delightfully refreshing. And so every so often I get a glimpse of incense smoke going across the room, and every so often the candle flame dances. I suppose another question could be, where do you take refuge in the Buddha? Where do you take refuge in the Dharma? And where do you take refuge in the Sangha? And if your answer is no, that's okay. To the first question, do you take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha? If your answer is no, that's perfectly okay. But I still have a question. What do you take refuge in? And that may be more tricky for you to answer. You may be inclined to say, I don't take refuge in anything. I don't see the need to. Okay. Well, I'm glad I asked the question. this idea of taking refuge goes back to the Buddha's day. People would join the Sangha and say, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Except for the first disciple, because there wasn't a Sangha to take refuge in. He just took refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma. But then there was a Sangha. So everybody else took refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. We could ask, what did the Buddha take refuge in? Maybe he only took refuge in the Buddha, possibly in the Dharma too. When we chant in San Francisco Zen Center, it's very interesting. We chant, I take refuge in Buddha. Okay. It's this, I take refuge in Buddha. So this was another part of my musings during the week, and has been from time to time over the years. Why did they drop the definite article? And what is the difference between saying, I take refuge in the Buddha, and I take refuge in Buddha? I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha, and I take refuge in Sangha. In dropping the definite article, and incidentally, I did hear a tape, I think it was an instruction tape for the Full Moon Bodhisattva Precept Ceremony, which was my opening chant. Not my opening chant, the chant I just gave. I heard a recording of it which had been made for instructional purposes. I think it was made in the 70s. And the chanter said, the Buddha. So at some point, San Francisco Zen Center must have had a meeting where they decided to drop the definite article. I used to think it was just that they were trying to imitate the way Japanese people said it. So maybe imitating Suzuki Roshi. But when I heard this tape, I realized that they had actually transitioned from saying the Buddha to saying Buddha. So when we say the Buddha, we seem to be referring to the historical figure, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha. And the Dharma, we are referring to the specific body of Buddhist teachings that lead us from samsara to nirvana, or lead us from the world of duality to the world of non-duality. Lead us from the world as duality to the world as non-duality. And when we say the Sangha, that had particular connotations of the community of people who practice. When we drop the definite article, it's more like we're saying, I take refuge in Buddha-ness. And I take refuge in not that teaching, but I take refuge in teaching, either as an activity in which there is a giver and receiver, or teaching and learning, the activity of participating in life in such a way that I'm learning how to live all the time. I take refuge in teaching, or in the activity of being a participant, either as a giver or receiver, as opposed to I take refuge in that teaching. I take refuge in the Sangha, or I take refuge in Sangha. If we replace it with the word community, I take refuge in community. Or I take refuge in that community. So in taking refuge in community, I'm taking refuge in the possibility of community, or I'm taking refuge in communion. Again, it's this activity of communing. I take refuge in communing. It's the communing rather than the community that is my refuge. So these subtle changes in words can have quite a big impact in the changing of meaning. So if you do take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are you saying that or not saying that? Another sense is that Siddhartha became the Buddha. But we don't, to draw an analogy or a parallel, we refer to the creator of the universe, but we don't refer to the God who created the universe. There's a difference in meaning. And it seems to me that when we use the word the, we are referring to what Siddhartha became. And when we drop the word the, we are referring to who Siddhartha became. So perhaps it is better to say Buddha instead of the Buddha. Perhaps. It would be very difficult to have this conversation with a Japanese person. And if Mitsue is listening, I hope she doesn't mind this little story. Mitsue came to visit me for a few days before we went to Venice in 2011 for Rohatsu in Venice, which was a really wonderful and remarkable experience. Or maybe it was that she came to visit me after Rohatsu. She was visiting some people in Europe and had practiced for a while at San Francisco Zen Center. But when she was over visiting me, I took her to see the Cliffs of Moher, and we dropped in to see Bernie. And so Bernie was part of the conversation. But she would often refer to when we went to see the Bernie. And I kind of thought this was amusing. And as a result of this, I sometimes think of Bernie as the Bernie. The shift in meaning is so subtle and difficult, or not difficult, but tenuous. Maybe somebody can explain it to me better. Maybe you can. And also, Mitsue would refer to, I put it on the Facebook. Delightfully amusing, the Facebook. So if we were in a school together and that school had a Facebook, which is where Facebook gets its name from, then we could say, I will put this in the Facebook, meaning the particular Facebook of the particular school in the Facebook. But Facebook as we know it today is not referred to as the Facebook. It's a thing in and of itself. So we simply refer to it as Facebook. Aye. So do you take refuge in either Buddha or the Buddha, Dharma or the Dharma, Sangha or the Sangha? And if you don't, what do you take refuge in? And it could be that you don't see the need to take refuge. And it could be that you don't see your own activity of taking refuge. But through practice, you may realize that you turn to things for comfort, for consolation, for succor, for refuge. And then you'll be able to tell me what it is that you take refuge in. I was trying to remember the name of the ship, the starship, in that novel by Philip K. Dick, A Maze of Death. And I couldn't remember it, so I looked it up. It was called the Perseus 9. So another question. Which ship would you rather be on? Perseus 9 or the Bounty? Which ship would you find it easier to take refuge on. There's a phrase in the Pali Canon, I think it goes something like this, renouncing this world with its Brahmins, its merchants, its kings, and its laity. And in describing this human world, this human society, by the categories of activity that you may be engaged in, or by the various lifestyles that people are engaging in, conjures up the notion of it as being a passing phenomenon. One that is not really worth your investment in. And this is one of the questions raised by impermanence. What is worthwhile? What is worth putting our energy into? What is worth giving our life energy to? Early in the week, a friend was at the doctor and called me to say that they had to go into hospital. So I said, okay, I'll take you there. This world of impermanence. In a modern sense of that phrase, with its Brahmins, its merchants, its kings, and its laity, we could say with its doctors and lawyers, professionals and tradespeople, there is this sense of a flow of society. There is this sense that you can be in any one of these walks of life. But how do we ascribe value to these walks of life, given that they are all impermanent? Given that time will wipe them all away. In the face of impermanence, what has value? On the one hand, it's great if you have a responsibility. If you're looking after a child or somebody who is sick, or somebody who is elderly, you know what you have to do. And so there is no question about what has value. But if you're not in that situation, then you can take on the existential question of life. how are we to live in a universe that seems to have no intrinsic value? What is it that is worthwhile, worth our energy, our effort, worth giving ourselves to? What is it that will satisfy my innermost longing? These were the questions that I was able to entertain when I started out on the Buddhist path, when I started Buddhist meditation practice. I had already gotten my dose of existentialist thinking. And that's another one that we could put into our description. This world with its doctors and lawyers, philosophers and merchants, with its financiers and poor people. We can put in various categories for the various walks of life that we could be in. How come you are in this walk of life and not that walk of life? Partly due to the circumstances of your birth, partly due to your DNA or inherited propensities, and partly to do with the choices that you've made, and those choices partly due to what you can perceive, and those perceptions partly due to your hardwiring or inner propensities, your DNA, personality characteristics. Do you just find yourself where you are, or is this where you chose to go? So in the early years of my meditation practice, I was in engineering college, Dublin Institute of Technology, and I had this thought. We could say it was an empowering thought. And maybe it was a thought that was a result of opening up to a set of new possibilities. I had the thought, there's enough engineers in the world and not enough meditation teachers. And that empowered me or liberated me, or was the result of the liberation that I was feeling. Which came first, the thought or the liberation or the thought? Let's say they came together. I felt liberated to give up engineering school and go more wholeheartedly into Buddhist practice. I had identified that as being the more valuable, the more meaningful, the more satisfying. These days, I might be inclined to say there's enough meditation teachers in the world. I'll become an engineer. So what is the walk of life that you are on, that you have been on? Is that walk of life your refuge? What is your refuge? What Buddha's practice offers, hopefully, is the possibility that no matter where you find yourself, no matter what your walk of life, you can do this practice. If you find yourself on the Bounty, or in Tahiti, or with Lieutenant Bligh and his followers, his people who stayed loyal to him, on this little boat, 20 people crowded into a rowing boat in the middle of the ocean. Or if you find yourself stranded on Perseus 9, you can take refuge. You can do this practice of being present. And this practice of being present changes things, that you see all these walks of life as being somewhat optional and arbitrary. And you get to sense the eternity that's just behind the door or the veil of each particular set of circumstances. There are situations that make it easier to sense that. And that is why we build or construct or form Zen temples and Zen communities. In those situations, we could call it in those ships of practice, it can be easier to get this sense that you're separated from eternity by just the thinnest of veils. And maybe even you may have the realization that the veil is an illusion and that you are not separated from eternity at all. Moments like this can be when you enter into the Zendo, or when you leave the Zendo after morning Zazen, and you just see the world as it is. And you realize that that is the same. That opportunity has been there through the ages that have been and will be there through the ages that are still to come. The sounds of land activity, machinery in gear. This is not longevity, but infinity. Spangler defined the culture that led to the present civilization as being different from previous cultures of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And he said it can be seen in the mathematics. Ancient Rome and ancient Greece did not, and deliberately did not, include the ideas of infinity and zero. But the culture that emerged just before the Renaissance, or was emerging in the Renaissance, did. And the present culture of the time, 1500s or so, 1400s, they embraced the idea of infinity, and it was not simply felt in its mathematics, but also in its architecture and in its notion of God. The early Christians, the ancient world, the Christianity of the ancient world, perceived God as being corporal and living in the heavens, in much the same way that we would experience or envision aliens as living on different stars, around different stars. They had this corporal idea of God, so very much centered in the physical. But in the period after or around the Renaissance, God was reinvented, and God was given the quality of being an infinite being. And it's this infinity again. Infinity is being brought into the culture. Churches changed their architecture from being more cave-like and entering the earth or entering into a cave, an enclosed space. Churches changed their architecture and became high-rise phenomena, reaching up into the skies and letting in lots of light through stained glass. This and the music change as well, reaching towards the infinite, towards the heavens, expansion into the infinite. But we have this practice that we can take with us everywhere and allows us to see the common thread through all this variety in culture and this variety in the walks of life. Still, we have to choose. Where is it that we want to go? What is it that we want to do? I have from time to time enjoyed reading Nietzsche. And when I lived in Wales, in a Buddhist retreat center in Wales, there was actually a a guy there whose doctorate was in Nietzsche. It was very invigorating living with him. It was almost like living with Nietzsche. But he pointed me to a commentator called Kaufman. And Kaufman has for many years been the leading authority on Nietzsche, and has been since the middle of the last century or earlier. But I remember reading one of Kaufman's introductions to Nietzsche, and he said, "It's impossible to read Nietzsche without thinking or feeling," I can't remember what word, without feeling, I must change my life. That's the kind of energy that Nietzsche can communicate or impart. But Nietzsche never tells you what you must change your life to. You just come away from reading him with this idea, I must do something. I must change my life. So if you are to change your life, what would you change it to? Would you prefer to be on the bounty? Would you prefer to be on Persis 9? Or would you prefer to be watering plants in your garden? And can you see that each of those has the same potential to be present and to see through the veil that separates you from eternity? If you can see that they each offer the same potential to see beyond or through that veil, then you can see that it doesn't really matter which one you are on. But my suspicion is that the conditions on the bounty were less conducive to seeing through that veil than the conditions in a Zen monastery, and the conditions in your garden, and the conditions even perhaps than would be found on the likes of Persis 9. It's possible to see through the veil under all circumstances, but some circumstances make it more difficult than others. And so we have to choose. What circumstances do we want to put ourselves in? And for some people who have a practice, this COVID practice period, if you'll excuse the word, has been a godsend. It has given them the space to go more deeply into their practice. And I'm hearing numerous reports of how grateful people are to have this practice. So in one sense, what we call lockdown or shelter in place has simplified our life so much that it's a little bit easier to get a sense of that veil that separates us from eternity. And for some people it isn't a veil, it's a wall. And the difference, I suspect, is our karma. Is your karma a veil? Or is your karma a wall? Through practice and practice and practice, the wall becomes a veil, and the veil becomes thinner and thinner until you see that there is no separation. So I made this decision to abandon the path to becoming an engineer and to take on this path of becoming a meditation teacher, but that has changed to simply being a Zen practitioner. Perhaps a Zen teacher. And made the decision that this path was truer or more vital than that path. And I have to live with the consequences of that. So this becoming something, this learning new skills, taking on a new way of life, takes effort. Keeping the precepts, or trying to, takes effort. Being patient takes effort. In fact, being patient takes a lot of effort or energy. Being patient requires a lot of strength. I was looking for my copy of the Life of the Buddha, and I was also looking for a copy of the Diamond Sutra, going through boxes of books. Found some interesting books, but not what I was looking for. And one of the books I came across was Shantideva's A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And in the copy that I have, energy is not translated as energy. It is translated as enthusiasm. Okay. But I think it was in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that I read Pirsig describing enthusiasm, coming from the Greek word enthusiasmos, which means a movement of the bowels. And it's this understanding that excitement or enthusiasm begins in our stomach or in our bowels, which is interesting because a lot of martial arts also see the same thing. So perhaps Shantideva, or this translation of Shantideva, is not completely off the mark by calling energy enthusiasm. This movement towards something, what we move towards, has to somehow inspire us and draw us towards it. We have to see something of value in where we're going. In the six perfections, energy is very similar to the Noble Eightfold Path, effort. And the word in the Noble Eightfold Path is samyak, which can mean right effort, the usual translation. But the word right can also mean perfect or complete. So as we move towards being present and we make the right effort to be present, or the right effort to engage in practice, our effort becomes more right the more we practice, becomes more complete, more wholehearted, involving all of our being and not just part of it. So this sense that what we are doing, although compared to all the other things that we could be doing, what we are doing, it's important that we do it wholeheartedly. Our effort becomes complete. And we can say that the completion of that effort, or the fruit of that effort, is that it takes us fully into the present moment. And by being fully in the present moment, our effort is complete. So being fully present is the completion of our effort, the result of our effort, but it also makes that effort complete in that it's all of us that does something. All of you is in your activity. So another part of the Noble Eightfold Path that this applies to is right action or perfect action. So the perfection of energy. It's understood as energy for the good, virya, energy for the good. It's not simply energy, like it has a direction. And that energy is for the good, for liberation, for nirvana, enlightenment, and the perfection or completion of that energy is its fulfillment. So we can talk about the six perfections or the six completions, the six things that are complete when you enter nirvana, or the six fulfillments. They are fulfilled when you enter nirvana. I would like to offer this for your consideration, for your mental exploration. The combination of patience and energy, the perfection of patience and the perfection of energy can be subsumed into one perfection, the perfection of becoming. And if we do this, then we are talking about 5 perfections, not 6. The perfection of becoming. We are always becoming something else. If we go back to one of the earlier talks, there's this notion that the king and queen would be very distressed if something were to happen to their beloved daughter, the princess. Well, something what did happen to her, she grew up. Okay. So we're always becoming something else because that's part of what we are. That's part of our being. Some of our becoming is simply due to our biology. We're going to grow older, and eventually we're going to get sick, and eventually we're going to decease. That's part of our biological trajectory, our becoming. And then there is the becoming in which we have a choice. To some extent, we can choose what we become. Our thoughts of today are our lives of tomorrow, it says in the Dhammapada, part of the Pali Canon. We can engage in meditation practices that make us more positive, more warm-hearted. The metta bhavana practice, bhavana, becoming metta, or the cultivation of metta. We can go to university and become a doctor of philosophy, becoming a doctor of philosophy. That was another choice I had to make. After living in Zen, Vajrakuta, the Buddhist community in Wales, I was really, really inspired by Zen books that I had read and decided I really should do something about this. I was also inspired by 2 doctors of philosophy living there. And my interest in philosophy was rekindled, and I was debating whether I should go back to university and study philosophy. And I was also inspired by the commitment of Theravadan monks, and I was thinking I should maybe go and be a Theravadan monk. But in the end, I decided on Zen. So we make this effort, where would I do Zen practice? And I ended up in California. We're always becoming, making an effort to become something else that we think will be better. If our trajectory, if our direction is towards nirvana or the present, or this thing that we call insight into things as it really is. If our trajectory is towards the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, as we chant at Zen Center, tasting the truth of the Buddha's words, if this is our trajectory, it will bear fruit. We will move closer and closer to the present. If your trajectory is to become a doctor of philosophy, you will make the moves necessary for that and eventually become a doctor of philosophy. If your trajectory, if your thrust is to become an architect, a nurse, an electrician, a Tai Chi teacher, you will make moves to realize that goal. We are constantly becoming. And the reason that I say those two perfections, patience and energy, can be subsumed into the perfection of becoming, is that the becoming which requires a choice requires our energy. It also requires patience. And this quote that I've not been able to track down its source, it was a translation from Japanese, is behind what I'm saying. When Buddha is in birth and death, there is no birth and death. Birth and death is another word for becoming. When Buddha is in your becoming, there is no becoming. So we become in such a way that we are present in every step. And so there is no sense of forcing the situation, no sense of grasping, no self of self, no sense of self in this becoming. It is emptiness, it is the becoming of emptiness. Just like the complete unfolding of the universe. These are my thoughts and reflections on this beautiful summer's day. On this day, where it is all the same day. Thank you very much.